Baltimore, Maryland. The morning after a steady rain, the city lingered in a damp chill. On the fifth floor of Johns Hopkins Children's Center hospital room, 512 stood eerily quiet. The bed was empty, sheets rumpled. A stuffed elephant lay on the cold floor. Emily Grace Hargrove, 3 years old, born with cystic fibrosis, had vanished. No one saw her leave. No cameras caught her. No signs of a break-in. Her parents sat frozen before the empty bed as security combed every corner of the hospital. The city of Baltimore was shaken. But over time, the headlines faded. The case went silent. Until one gray morning 2 years later, when a sewer maintenance crew happened to pull something out of the city's storm drain, something that made David Hargrove's heart stop, and opened the door to a truth darker than his worst fears. Baltimore, Maryland, a night in early March 2022. The rain had stopped, leaving beads of water clinging to the window ledge of room 512. The harsh fluorescent light bathed the hospital bed where Emily Grace Hargrove, just 3 years old, lay asleep, her fragile breath whispering through the nasal cannula, the oxygen tank secured behind her little blue wheelchair. The frame was covered in stickers. Spider-Man, Captain America, Wonder Woman, what Emily called her good luck charms. David Hargrove had visited late that night after a long, weary shift at work. He sat by his daughter, holding her tiny hand, waiting until her eyelids finally drooped before leaning down to kiss her forehead and slipping quietly out of the room. In the hallway, there were only the faint hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of tired nurses. Before leaving the hospital, he glanced back one last time, seeing her door ajar, the light still on his little girl safe, or so he believed. The next morning, when the early shift opened, room 512, it was empty. The bed was rumpled. The monitors were dark wires dangling uselessly. Her stuffed elephant lay face down on the cold tile floor. The little blue wheelchair was gone. No one had seen Emily leave. No one had seen anyone suspicious. The hallway camera showed nothing but a stretch of eerie silence. Police were called in immediately. Floors were locked down, every exit checked, every storage room searched. But there was no trace of her, as if she had simply vanished. Sarah Hargrove collapsed to the floor, sobbing, repeating the same question no one could answer. How? How could someone take her and no one notice? In the following days, Emily's photo dominated Baltimore's evening news. The Sun ran bold headlines. 3-year-old girl vanishes from Johns Hopkins. Flowers and teddy bears piled up at the hospital gates. Volunteers canvassed the neighborhoods, handing out flyers of Emily in her pink princess dress, smiling innocently. But as weeks turned to months, the leads dried up. The investigation cooled, and everything fell silent. 2 years later, in March 2024, on a gray morning, a city maintenance crew was sent to clear blockages in one of Baltimore's main storm drains. When they finally hauled up something large and cumbersome lodged in the current, it was a child's wheelchair, blue frame caked in mud, oxygen tank still attached, and the superhero stickers still intact. That night, when David Hargrove's phone rang, he didn't answer right away. It had been a long time since anyone called about Emily. But then he picked up, and a calm woman's voice said, "Mr. Hargrove, this is Detective Karen Williams with the Baltimore Police Department. We've found something. You'll want to come down right away to confirm." On the other end of the line, his voice cracked to a whisper, "Is it Emily?" A beat of silence. Then the detective replied gently, "I can't say anything for certain over the phone, sir. But I believe this could be the turning point in her case." That night, David's house sank into heavy silence, broken only by the soft patter of drizzle on the porch. One question kept echoing in his mind: if Emily is still alive. Where has she been, and with whom? The sky was still overcast as David Hargrove drove toward downtown Baltimore the next morning. He hadn't slept a minute. His mind kept circling back to the image of the little blue wheelchair, caked with mud, plastered with faded superhero stickers, the only thing dredged from the city's storm drain the day before. What did it mean? Hope or the end, he had to know. The Baltimore Police Headquarters sat wedged between rows of old brick buildings, damp and nondescript. David walked briskly through the antiseptic-smelling corridor. His hands clenched so tight, his knuckles were white. A uniformed officer led him into the evidence room. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, on a steel table draped in a blue tarp, sat the wheelchair. Mud clung to the frame in thick streaks. The oxygen tank was still attached to the back, the gauge foggy and nearly empty. The superhero stickers, though, faded, still clung desperately. Spider-Man, Captain America, Wonder Woman, remnants of what little joy Emily had left. David stood frozen before the table, chest tightening. He didn't need anyone to tell him he knew. This was Emily's wheelchair. Next to it lay a sealed evidence bag with a torn, filthy strap, from the seat tangled with a few strands of fine blonde hair. People around him murmured scribbled notes, but David didn't hear them. His eyes locked on every familiar detail: the chipped corner where Emily used to tap her finger, the lopsided Spider-Man sticker she'd placed herself, the faint scrape on the oxygen tank where it had hit the doorframe that last night. The crew had found it lodged against a grate in one of the storm drains leading into the main canal after last week's heavy rain. The preliminary forensic report said it had only been there a few weeks at most. The mud was still fresh. The metal wasn't rusted through like it would have been after 2 years. So where had it been all this time? And why now David left the evidence room, dazed, the cold wind outside cutting into his skin, though he barely felt it. Sitting in his car, he gripped the wheel, head bowed. That mud-streaked wheelchair floated in his mind like a grim message someone had kept Emily all this time and only now decided to clean up. He didn't believe it was an accident. Not something the rain had swept away. Not something the river had claimed. Someone here in this city had hidden Emily for 2 long years. The nausea rose, mingling with a searing anger deep in his chest. The police would investigate, they said. They'd check surrounding storm drains, collect sediment samples, trace the current. But David knew they'd take their time, buried in paperwork and procedure. He couldn't wait. He drove aimlessly around the city, through the damp streets of Harbor East, past alleys that smelled of garbage, past the elegant homes lining the Patapsco River. Everyone he saw could have been the one who had her. Everyone could have been the one who threw her chair away. By late afternoon, he returned to their small house where Sarah was preparing dinner. The kitchen smelled of stew and caramelized onions. She glanced back at him, eyes red-rimmed, saying nothing, just resting a hand firmly on his shoulder. In Emily's bedroom, everything was exactly as it had been the night she disappeared. Toys neatly stacked her princess blanket, folded the spare oxygen tank, resting by the dresser. David sat on the bed, turning one of her dusty dolls over in his hands. On the wall, a photo of Emily beamed down at him. Her blue eyes seemed to ask, "Why haven't you found me yet?" That night, he couldn't sleep. The streetlight outside cast a dull glow through the curtains. He got up and pulled open the drawer in his desk where he kept the investigation files. Police statements, hospital maps, the staff roster from that night. And one name jumped out at him: Dr. Richard Bennett, Emily's primary physician, the one who reassured them over and over, the one everyone said cared more than necessary about his patients, and the one who, according to the report, clocked out at 6:00 p.m. that night and had no verified alibi for the rest of the evening. David stared at Bennett's sloppy blue ink signature at the bottom of his statement. Emily's wheelchair had just been thrown away. After 2 years of silence. Just as the hospital's HR department had opened an inquiry into Bennett's unspecified administrative violations. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe not. David shut the folder, his hands trembling, and he swore to himself if the police couldn't find her, he would. The next morning, David sat in his car outside the parking lot of Johns Hopkins Children's Center, clutching the old police file. On the cover, the name Richard Bennett, M.D., stood out next to a short note: "Not suspicious, reasonable alibi." He felt a bitter taste rise in his throat. 2 years ago, he'd believed that. Believed Dr. Bennett was an ally, someone so devoted to Emily that it almost reassured the family to leave her in his care. Now looking back, that over-devotion sent a chill down his spine. He walked into the hospital, through the stark white lobby, down to the personnel records office. A clerk behind the desk glanced up vaguely wary, but David only forced a thin smile, handing over a few forms and requesting a copy of his daughter's medical records for investigative purposes. The clerk nodded and disappeared. While he waited, David opened his phone and typed Richard Bennett's name into Google. The usual glowing headlines came first. Pediatric lung specialist goes above and beyond, a champion for sick children. But scrolling deeper, he began to find cracks. A 6-year-old news blurb from Cincinnati, Dr. Bennett departs amid administrative changes. A vague disciplinary note from Philadelphia for failure to follow care protocol. Cold, bureaucratic language like each hospital was eager to bury whatever had happened as long as he left quietly. David jotted down dates and locations, closed his phone just as the clerk returned with Emily's records. Back in his car, he flipped through the thick stack of papers. Test results, treatment plans, everything painstakingly documented in Bennett's handwriting. Every dose of medication, every fever, every midnight cough. No other nurse or physician had been that meticulous, that present. No one else came by her room in the middle of the night. On his way home, David stopped by the neighborhood pharmacy to pick up some medicine for Sarah. While waiting in line, he froze when he spotted a familiar figure, Richard Bennett, in a gray suit, pushing a cart piled high with portable oxygen tanks and medical supplies. Bennett didn't notice him. He chatted casually with the clerk, swiped his card, and methodically loaded each tank into his cart as if nothing were unusual. From a distance, David watched his pulse quickening. Bennett was head of pediatrics. Why was he buying equipment like that himself? Didn't the hospital have its own supply chains? And more importantly, what was he doing with so many oxygen tanks? When Bennett left, David stepped outside, his whole body taut. In his mind, the mud-caked wheelchair and the pharmacy cart full of oxygen tanks overlapped the pieces, swirling in a tangled storm. That night, David skipped dinner. Sarah quietly cleared the table, without asking, only glancing at him with worried eyes. He sat in his study, reopening the police file and the notes he'd started about Bennett. 4 hospitals in 8 years, each departure blamed on administration noncompliance or restructuring. His license never revoked, never sued. But all the vague whispers and cracks lined up into a thin red thread, one that led straight back to Emily. Near midnight, David reread Bennett's statement from the night Emily vanished. I left my shift at 18:00. Went home alone. No one else present. No one to confirm. He closed the file, laying it on the desk. The yellow light pooled over his face, tense, resolute. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And he swore to himself he would dig until he found the truth, even if it meant breaking the rules, even if it meant risking everything. He would not let his daughter drift into the dark for another day. The next morning, David returned to the hospital. This time, he didn't walk through the main lobby or stop at the reception desk. Instead, he slipped through the service entrance where delivery trucks came and went, stopping in the rear parking lot. There, tucked into a shadowy corner, sat the familiar gray Accord. David leaned against a concrete pillar, eyes fixed on the staff door. He knew what he was doing was reckless, but he had no choice. At exactly 7:42, Bennett appeared, leather briefcase in hand, walking briskly, all business. But David had learned to notice the small, tells the quick glance over his shoulder, the fingers drumming lightly on the strap signs of a man carrying a secret. David waited a few minutes, then followed. He kept just far enough behind, weaving through corridors and stairwells. Bennett went straight up to the 6th floor of the pulmonary ward. For over an hour, he moved from room to room, checking charts, directing nurses. Everything. Perfect. But then, just past 10, Bennett suddenly left his office carrying a medical supply bag and headed down to the parking garage. David froze for a second, then followed. Bennett started his car and drove out of the lot. David rushed to his own car and kept on his tail. The drive stretched across dozens of city blocks, through the damp market district, past Inner Harbor, and out onto the quieter streets of the suburbs. At each red light, Bennett checked his rearview eyes, narrowing slightly. David gripped the wheel tighter, heart pounding. Finally, Bennett turned into an old gas station off Hartford Road and parked. He got out, pulling a few fuel cans from his trunk, stacking them on a cart. David stayed farther back, hidden behind a row of delivery trucks. A man in a brown jacket approached Bennett. They spoke briefly, and Bennett slipped him a thick envelope before taking back a sealed bag filled with vials and several syringes. David clenched the steering wheel, his breath quickening. Nothing about this looked like legitimate hospital business. The trip continued another 10 minutes. Bennett merged onto I-95, then turned off onto a narrow dirt road leading toward Gunpowder Falls State Park. A weathered sign read, "Campground 3 miles." David stopped at a safe distance, watching as the gray Accord disappeared into the trees. He didn't dare follow any farther. Not yet. No plan. No backup. But now he knew Bennett regularly drove to somewhere remote. That night, David sat alone in his study phone, in hand Detective Karen Williams's name blinking on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button. But then, he pulled back. He couldn't risk the police ruining this fragile lead. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to see it for himself. Something burned inside him now, like embers ready to ignite if Bennett had hidden Emily for 2 years. Then she might still be there, and no one else would find her. 2 days later, David returned to the dirt road leading into Gunpowder Falls. This time, he came earlier, wearing a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low, carrying a small pair of binoculars, a fully charged phone, and a folding knife. Not to fight, just to feel less exposed. The narrow road wound deeper, the pine forest thickening around him, casting long shadows. He parked nearly a mile from the campground gate and continued on foot, boots sinking softly into the carpet of dead leaves. The deeper he went, the colder and damper the air felt. A lone bird called in the distance, but he barely noticed. By late morning, David saw it, a plain wooden cabin tucked between tall pines. No house number, no clear path leading in. The windows were covered tightly, the chimney cold. Beside it, the same gray Honda Accord sat neatly parked. He crouched behind an oak, his heart hammering. The cabin looked completely ordinary, like hundreds of other weekend retreats scattered through Maryland's forests. But David knew. Inside lay a different world entirely. He watched for nearly an hour, seeing nothing. Then suddenly the door opened. Richard Bennett stepped out, a plastic bag in hand, locking up before heading to his car. He moved without hurry, infuriatingly calm. David ducked lower, watching Bennett drive off until the car disappeared around a bend. The forest returned to silence, the wind whispering through the treetops. He stood, moving carefully toward the cabin. The front door was secured with a heavy steel padlock, but David circled to the side, where a small window was cracked open an inch. He pressed his face to the gap. Inside, the living room was modest and tidy. An old sofa, a small kitchen, a few bookshelves. But what froze him were the medical supplies stacked in the corner. Oxygen tanks, boxes of medication, a nebulizer, V-stands. On the table lay an open notebook, pages full of neat handwriting. He caught just the first few words on the current page, Emily Day, 7:14. A chill crawled up his spine. He didn't dare imagine more. David backed away, trying to leave quickly and quietly. By the time he reached his car, his hands were trembling. That night back home, he said nothing to Sarah. He locked himself in his study, spreading the file on the desk, scribbling frantic notes. Gunpowder cabin, strong evidence. Emily, possibly there. Bennett keeping records. Medical supplies intact. Can't delay further. He stared at his phone, Detective Karen Williams's name still pinned to the top of his contacts. But the thought of the police, the red tape, the waiting made him hesitate. If Bennett caught wind of this, he'd erase everything. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the window panes. In his mind, one question repeated over and over: is she still alive? And if she was, would he cross that fragile line between the law and his instincts to bring Emily home? That night, David's house was suffocatingly quiet. Sarah was out working her night shift. He stayed behind alone. The case files spread across the desk, his laptop screen still glowing Google Maps open to the winding dirt road that led to the cabin. Time felt frozen thick. The wind howled through the porch, rattling the shutters. David just sat there, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the screen. Finally he stood, walked to the bedroom, and pulled open the dresser drawer, retrieving the Glock he'd kept in his gun safe, a relic from his years in the National Guard. He checked the magazine chambered around and tucked it into his coat pocket. But as he was stepping toward the door, a knock came. He froze. The knock was slow, deliberate, echoing through the dark hallway. David stepped into the living room, peeking through the curtain. A figure stood on the porch, tall, clad in a gray coat head, bowed under a cap. David didn't move. Then a low voice carried through the door. "I know you're in there, David." His breath caught. His heart pounded. "Open the door. We need to talk." David stayed still, his hand inching toward the gun in his coat. The knock came again, harder this time. Then the figure leaned down, and the doorknob began to turn. David's stomach dropped. He'd forgotten to lock it. The hinges groaned as the door creaked open. The man stepped inside, closing it behind him with a deliberate, quiet click. In the yellow light, the familiar face came into view. Richard Bennett. His gray eyes were ice, and in his hand David caught a glint of steel, a compact pistol. Bennett didn't shout, didn't rush. He only walked slowly toward David, his gaze sweeping over the files scattered on the table, then pausing on the glowing laptop screen. "You've dug too deep, David." His voice was low, steady, not exactly angry, but carrying something dark simmering. David gripped his own gun in his pocket, but didn't draw it. The air between them felt heavy enough to choke on. Bennett stopped in the center of the living room, his finger tightening slightly on his weapon, raising it just enough to make his point clear. "We're going to take a drive, just you and me. No noise, no stupid moves. Do what I say. And this can end quietly." David said nothing, staring him down. Outside, the wind swept leaves across the porch, the night swallowing everything. In that moment, David knew every line he'd drawn in his mind was gone. Tonight, he wouldn't wait for the police, wouldn't wait for justice. Tonight, he would walk straight into the lion's den, even if he didn't come back. He gave a faint nod and stepped out into the darkness, letting it swallow them both. The black night swallowed the two figures as they stepped onto the porch. The wind cut through cold and sharp, carrying the damp smell of earth and rotting leaves. Bennett walked ahead, shoulders slightly hunched, one hand hidden in his coat pocket, gripping a gun, his pace slow but steady. David followed his own hand, still gripping the Glock in his jacket, his palms slick with cold sweat. The gray Accord waited in the driveway, headlights off its body, streaked with rain and dirt. Bennett opened the driver's door, casting a glance at David through the tinted window. David didn't resist. He slid into the passenger seat. The soft click of the door closing sounded like a blade drawn across the silence. Bennett started the engine. The dashboard glowed faintly, the needle on the speedometer quivering. Tires crunched over the wet street as they pulled away from the quiet Baltimore neighborhood. They glided past rows of row houses' streetlights, casting long golden streaks across the wet asphalt. The city lay silent at this hour. No one knew what was unfolding behind the glass of that car, a father and the man who had stolen his daughter for 2 long years. David kept his gaze on the window. In the glass, Bennett's pale face reflected back at him, jaw-set, gray eyes cold and unreadable. He said nothing. The farther they drove from the city, the emptier the roads became. Neighborhoods gave way to open fields, then to stretches of shadowy trees. Streetlights grew sparse, and the darkness deepened. Only the beams of the headlights cut through it, sweeping over the winding 2-lane road that led toward Gunpowder Falls. In David's mind, questions churned. Was Emily still alive? Where was she? Why was Bennett bringing him out here tonight to bargain, to threaten, or to silence him forever? His fingers brushed the gun in his pocket. Part of him screamed to pull it out, end it now. But here, in the depths of these woods, a single missed shot could mean losing Emily forever. The speedometer hovered at 50. They turned onto the narrow dirt road David already knew so well. The tires crunched over dry twigs and dead leaves, dust swirling in the headlights. Pines loomed tall and black on either side, whispering secrets in the wind. And then the cabin came into view, its windows dark, unlit. The unassuming shape of it never looked so menacing. Bennett slowed, parking close to the porch. The engine cut out, leaving only silence. He opened his door, glanced back at David, without a word, just a slight nod, a command. David stepped out. The ground beneath his shoes was damp and cold. He inhaled sharply, catching the faint smell of old wood and smoke clinging to the air. Bennett led the way. The wooden steps creaked under their weight, each sound cutting through the stillness like a warning. The cabin door opened and darkness spilled out. Bennett flicked on the light, casting a yellow glow over the modest living room, an old sofa, a small kitchen shelves of books. In the corner, neat stacks of medical supplies, oxygen tanks, boxes of medicine IV stands glinting faintly. David's pulse roared in his ears. The air was thick sour with antiseptic and old wood. On the table lay a thick notebook already open. Emily Day, 716. Bennett's hand rested on his holstered gun, his gray eyes drilling into David's as he spoke, his voice low-cutting. "You wanted to see this place. Now you have. She's still here." David froze, his breath catching. At the end of the narrow hallway, a small wooden door stood closed, a heavy steel padlock clamped over it. His eyes locked on it, chest heaving. Outside, the woods were silent, watching. And David knew this was his moment, his one chance to bring his daughter home. The door at the end of the hallway loomed like a blade driven into David's sightline. The steel padlock was dull and weathered the yellow light from the living room, casting a faint shadow across the wooden wall. He stood frozen, breath-heavy heart, hammering so hard it felt like it might explode. Bennett slowly removed his gloves, hung up his coat, methodical as ever. The gun never left his hand, his finger tracing the grip, keeping it low, but always ready. He moved to the table and flipped his thick notebook to a fresh page, as though it were just another night. Another entry. Emily Day, 7/17. The pen hovered. A black dot of ink bled into the paper. David stared at him, chest-heaving fingers, tightening around the Glock hidden in his pocket, sweat slick on his palm. Every nerve screamed, "Now." In one swift motion, he drew his gun, leveling it at Bennett. The room froze. Bennett's head lifted, a faint, crooked smile curling at the corner of his mouth, but there was something behind his gray eyes this time. Something surprised. David stepped toward the hallway, keeping the gun steady at Bennett's chest. Back he growled, his own voice, rough, almost unrecognizable to himself. Bennett stepped back, once gun still in his hand, but lowered his gaze, sharp, almost contemptuous. David reached the door. The steel padlock was cold against his fingers. He kept his gun raised as he unlatched it, the metallic clink loud as a gunshot in the silence. The door swung open. A rush of cold, stale air spilled out of the small, narrow room. The smell of antiseptic and old wood mingled in the dark. The weak light from the living room only cast a thin strip of illumination across the floor. On a small bed, pressed against the wall, Emily sat. She was thinner than he remembered, her long blonde hair hanging loose, partially hiding her face. Wide, frightened blue eyes reflected the dim light. A nasal cannula rested under her nose, the oxygen tank beside her, an IV line dangling off the side of the bed. David's breath hitched. The world stopped. "Emily," he whispered, his voice shaking. She blinked at him, confused, shrinking back slightly. For a moment, her eyes were blank. Then they glistened, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Behind him, Bennett finally broke the silence, his voice low and heavy. "You'll never understand what she needs. Never. You'll ruin her." David didn't turn around. He kept his gun up, his other hand slowly reaching toward his daughter. Her tiny, trembling fingers met his like touching a memory he thought he'd lost. The faint wail of sirens echoed from far away. Red and blue lights flickered faintly beyond the trees. Someone had called the police. Maybe Sarah, maybe a neighbor. David didn't care. Bennett backed toward the table, his gun sagging, his expression hollow. Now, his eyes distant, filled with a bitter kind of defeat. David scooped Emily into his arms, pressing her close, his gun still steady, backing toward the door. He said nothing, only held her tighter. Outside, the patrol lights slashed through the darkness, carving beams through the towering pines. And for the first time in 2 years, David felt his daughter's breath against his chest. Alive. Outside the cabin, red and blue lights pulsed against the dark pines, slicing through the black silence. Police had arrived, their shouted commands booming through the stillness of the woods. Figures moved across the porch, flashlights sweeping every corner. David stood there, holding Emily in his arms. She pressed herself into his chest, her fragile breath rising and falling against his heart, steady and real. Life. Something he thought he'd lost now, cradled in his hands. Bennett was forced to his knees, his wrists pinned behind his back as they dragged him toward a patrol car. His face was pale and hollow. As they pushed him past, his gray eyes found David's, then Emily's. No anger now, no twisted smile, just a cold emptiness, as though he'd just lost the only thing tethering him to the world. David looked down at Emily. She still hadn't spoken, her blue eyes wet with tears, blinking faintly. He took the thin blanket a medic handed him, wrapping her tightly, his hand gently patting her back, just as he had the night she was born. "You're safe now," he whispered hoarsely. "It's over." All the way back to the hospital, David never let her go. She stayed curled against him, glancing out the ambulance window, at the darkness outside, as though afraid it still held something waiting to take her. At Johns Hopkins, Sarah was already waiting. Her face was pale, eyes red from crying, but the instant she saw Emily, she broke into sobs, running to them, throwing her arms around them, both fingers trembling as she touched her daughter's hair. In the ICU, doctors worked quickly, reconnecting IV lines, changing oxygen, listening to her lungs, monitoring her heart. Sarah stood by her side, watching every number on the screen, one hand gripping Emily's, the other holding David's. David just stood there still, as stone eyes fixed on each fragile breath his daughter took. They told him it would be a long road, that Emily's body was weakened from 2 years of inconsistent care, her mind carrying deep scars. Therapy would take years. The memories of what happened might never fully fade. But she was alive. That night, David sat by her ICU bed while Sarah dozed in a chair nearby. He stroked Emily's hair as her eyes cracked open, faint and uncertain. Her small voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. "Daddy?" Really, David froze, then nodded, tears falling onto her hand. "Really," he said. "I'm here. Always." Emily blinked, then closed her eyes again, her tiny fingers still clutching his. Outside, the first light of dawn began to spill through the hospital window, soft and pale. On the monitor, numbers pulsed in a steady rhythm, each beat, each breath a quiet testament. Proof that Emily had come home, proof that the long night was over, proof that the monster would never touch her again. David gripped her hand tighter and leaned close, whispering, "We'll heal, sweetheart. Little by little. I promise." The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, soft, quiet music. A sad song, but this time it was a song of life.